Hear what God's Spirit is saying to you. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to strangers. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. And if at all possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," says the Lord. No, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you will heap burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Here ends the reading of words that give us insight on God. May God grant to us wisdom and courage for interpretation.
Les Miserables, Les Mis, premiered in Paris in 1980 in French. There was an English version by 1985, premiering in London, which has continued to run to this day. The Broadway version premiered in 1987 and ran to 2003. There have since been a couple of revivals. And of course, there was a film in 2012 with mixed reviews. This makes Les Mis the second longest running musical in the entire world. How many of you have seen a production of Les Mis? Maybe half, 3/4 of you. So you know the story. You know that the sung-through musical was based on an 1862 novel by Victor Hugo. This novel is over 1,500 pages in English, even more in the original French, and about 1/4 of that is devoted to Hugo's own moral philosophy. It doesn't do much to advance the plot, but it's interesting to read. You have to have a little bit of time, though, to get through it. In this play, you see several characters that we follow, but most notably, Jean Valjean, prisoner 24601. And the first time that we encounter him, he is serving the last day of a 19-year prison sentence. He wound up in prison because he stole a loaf of bread for his starving nephew. He was given 5 years for that, the rest because he had tried to escape. And the prisoners in the song called Look Down talk about how hopeless life in prison is. But Jean Valjean has made it, and he is given his parole papers by Javert, the police officer who has been supervising his prison sentence. And he leaves only to discover that when he has to present everyone with that parole paper to try and get work, that he's unable to find a job. He's unable to support himself. We recognize what this is like, right? Because many people in our society face the same kind of thing. People often go to prison, frequently for non-violent offenses, and then they carry that label with them for the rest of their lives, and they're unable to find a job. And oftentimes that leads to desperation and kind of the cycle where they turn back to crime. Well, it's the same with Jean Valjean. Out of desperation, he goes trying to find just basic needs, and he encounters a bishop who has a kind place in his heart and takes Jean Valjean in. He gives him a place to lay his head, and he gives him food to eat. And how does Valjean repay him? He makes off with the silver in the night. It's not long before he's caught, and he tells the police officers that the bishop has given him that silver. A lie, of course. But they take him back to the bishop, and they say, "Did you give him the silver?" And he says, "Yes." And he says, "But Valjean, you forgot the most important part. You forgot the candlesticks." And he takes the candlesticks off of his table and puts them in the bag. The police are surprised, but they leave. And the bishop says, "Valjean, take these and make yourself a better man, for I bought your soul for God." And Valjean has this moment, this very poignant moment where he sings a song, doing this soul-searching, wondering who he is and where he ought to go, how he ought to live his life. And he realizes that he can never escape his past as prisoner 24601, as Jean Valjean. And so he decides to leave it behind. He breaks his parole and changes his name. Hugo wrote in the novel, this was not a transformation. It was transfiguration. Of course, Christians understand what that means because we recognize the story of Jesus' transfiguration. When Jesus went up on the mountaintop and was completely transformed as flesh and bone into pure light, it was the author's way of saying, hey, if you follow Jesus, things are going to change. If you follow Jesus, your life is going to be transfigured. It's going to be transformed into this new thing. And so it is for Valjean. This, of course, is what Paul is writing about in today's scripture lesson, too. In his letter to the Romans, he's writing about what a Christian life transformed looks like, what it means to be transfigured by following Christ. And he describes what this Christian community ought to look like. And there is so much packed into these few verses that it's hard to even break apart. But he says, hey, Christian community, you ought to love one another. You ought to be kind to one another. You ought to celebrate when it's time to celebrate, to take time to rejoice. You ought to mourn when people are mourning. And you ought to take care of those who are in need. That's what it means to be a Christian. It means to live your life in a transfigured way, in a transformed way. This, of course, is what Valjean experiences as well. The next time that we see him, he's no longer Jean Valjean. He's Monsieur Le Maire. He's used those gifts given from the bishop, and he has built for himself a new life. He's now a wealthy factory owner. He's a pillar of the community, in fact. And in his factory, there's a woman working named Fantine, and she's beautiful. And the foreman notices that she's beautiful, and he makes moves on Fantine, which she refuses and he gets angry about. Imagine that, a woman wanting control over her own body, wanting to make decisions about her own body. And whenever she refuses his advances, he begins to take it out on the other factory workers, and they begin to resent Fantine. And then one day she gets a letter in the mail, and it's asking for money. It turns out that Fantine has a daughter who she's had out of wedlock named Cosette. And Cosette is being cared for by a greedy innkeeper and his wife. Well, the other factory workers, they use this situation to get Fantine fired. And Monsieur Le Maire, Jean Valjean, is too distracted to notice because who is the new inspector in this northern French town? None other than Javert, who could threaten his new life. What if he recognized him from his days in prison? And so Fantine is out on the street, and she's forced to sell her locket, and then her hair, and then her teeth, and then her body. And before long, she's very sick. And one night, a potential customer comes up and is aggressive towards her, and she injures him while fighting him off. And who comes but Javert, ready to arrest Fantine? But Le Maire, Jean Valjean, intercedes and takes her and recognizes that she had worked in his factory and that he had failed to protect her. And so he vows to care for her daughter, Cosette. Of course, Javert wondered if this man, Monsieur Le Maire, might be Jean Valjean, and had sent off a letter wondering. And they discovered that someone has been captured for Jean Valjean's crime. And Valjean now has a decision to make. Is he going to take responsibility for the things that he's done? Or is he going to let this innocent man take responsibility for him? If he lets this man take his responsibility, he's home free. And so there's this soul-searching song, Who Am I?, where he asks that question. Who am I? Can I let this man be punished for what I've done? And he decides no, he goes. And he tells the court, I am Jean Valjean. And Javert comes to arrest him. He pleads with Javert, saying, can I please care for Cosette? And of course he won't let him. So Valjean flees again, this time stopping to pick up Cosette and paying off the greedy innkeeper and his wife. And they change identities once again. This is a poignant moment because as Cosette begins to grow up and Valjean becomes her father, he begins to recognize that by loving Cosette, his priorities are changing. He's no longer living for himself, he's living for this other person. Parenthood does that. It makes you live for this other person. And he recognizes that he's changing. In the song that was sung at the very beginning of the service, there's a line in there, to love another person is to see the face of God. And he recognizes that he sees the face of God in Cosette. That his life is being transfigured. This, of course, is what Jesus was talking about in all of his ministry, that by loving other people, that by doing God's work in the world, that when we do those things, that it transforms us, it transforms our lives, it makes our lives different than they might have otherwise been. So the next time we see Jean Valjean and Cosette, Cosette is grown. It's now 1832, and they're on the eve of the June Rebellion. Parisian Republicans are not happy with the monarchy and are about to rebel as soon as the beloved General Lamarck dies. Cosette and Valjean are assaulted in the street, almost robbed by none other than the innkeeper and his wife, Cosette's former caretakers. And who arrives to stop the burglary? None other than Javert. Valjean runs away, afraid once again that this past is coming to get him. But in that moment, Cosette sees a young rebel, Marius, and it is love at first sight for both of them. Marius finds out where Cosette lives, and he goes to see her, and they confess their love for each other. Marius returns to be with the rebels. Valjean makes plans to go to England, but he finds out about their love and decides to go behind the barricade and join the rebels to protect Marius. And when he gets there, he points out a French soldier, and the rebels are able to take him down, and they're grateful to Valjean. And he sees that they captured Javert. And he asks for Javert's life to be placed in his hands. Javert thinks it's over. This is a guy that he's been chasing. This is a hardened criminal, Valjean. And what does Jean Valjean do? He lets Javert go. Javert can't make sense of this. How can this criminal, Jean Valjean, someone who's been on the run for so long, how could he let him go? You know, it's like Paul says in today's scripture lesson, if you encounter your enemy and they're hungry, give them food. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. Be kind to them, and it will be like heaping burning coals on their head. Do not overcome evil with evil, but overcome evil with good. And so that kindness is like heaping coals on Javert's head, and he can't understand it. And he throws himself in the river. And then Valjean looks at Marius, and he sings this beautiful song that James sung so wonderfully a few moments ago. Bring him home. Bring him home. A prayer to God to keep Marius safe in the midst of all of this violence. Of course, Valjean becomes the answer to his own prayer. It's like Frederick Douglass said, "I prayed for 20 years and never saw answers until I started praying with my feet." Marius is in the midst of this battle, and Valjean protects him. All the other rebels are shot and killed, and Marius is shot. But Valjean takes him and drags him through the sewers, trying to get him home to be with Cosette. He's so transformed by this love for Cosette that he'll sacrifice even himself to ensure that Cosette can be happy. And once Marius is recuperated, Valjean decides, of course not knowing that Javert is dead, that he can never fully escape his past. And the only way that Cosette can be happy is if he's no longer there. And so he swears Marius to secrecy, and he leaves. Cosette can't understand. He gets sick and is on the edge of death. And Cosette and Marius, on their wedding night, discover where Jean Valjean is, and they're able to go and say goodbye just in time before Fantine comes and leads him into the light. This is a poignant story. A poignant story. And Victor Hugo wrote, "Within every human soul, there is this primitive spark, this divine element that is incorruptible in this life and immortal in the next. It can be developed by goodness, kindled, lit up to radiate, and evil can never fully overcome it." Powerful words to write about the characters which he described as les misérables, the miserable ones, the wretched ones. That even despite everything that was going on in their lives, that they had this divine spark within them. That God was within them. It's a powerful story because it talks about many of the same things that we deal with today. Disparity between rich and poor. The stigma of prison that can follow people all of their lives. Women's rights. And of course, the way that God is always at work transforming us and transforming our world. Friends, may our hearts be open to God's transfiguration. And may God use us to be symbols of light, to radiate in all the world. May it be so. Amen.